Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, The Total Economic Impact of Pivot3 Hyperconverged Infrastructure. My name is Stacy Buckland and I'm the Marketing Programs Manager at Pivot3 and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and we'll email it out to everybody after the event. We've also included some digital handouts to provide more information on Pivot3 and Hyperconverged Infrastructure, which you can access from the Handouts pane on the control panel at the side of your screen. The full Forrester TEI study that we'll be discussing today is located in that Handouts pane, so make sure you download that today as well for more reference on what we're talking about. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please type them into the question box on the side of your screen. We'll be addressing your questions at the end of the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. Bob Cormier is a Vice President and Principal Consultant in Forrester's Total Economic Impact Service. He is a leading expert on deriving business value from technology investments and helps organizations understand the overall financial value of IT strategies and investments. Bob works with B2B marketing professionals in their efforts to clearly articulate the unique value proposition of their solutions. He also serves as a trusted advisor to CIOs and their staff to create consistent, repeatable processes to justify and add credibility to technology investment business cases using Forrester's TEI methodology. We're also joined today by Bruce Milne, Chief Marketing Officer at Pivot3. Bruce will kick us off by providing a brief introduction to Pivot3 before we get into the results of the Forrester TEI study. Now I'll go ahead and turn things over to start our presentation.
Thank you, Stacy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And thanks very much to Bob for agreeing to present with us here on this call. We thank everybody for their time today, and I think it's an exciting time to be in IT. There's lots going on in this market. I wanted to take a couple of minutes to introduce to you who Pivot3 is and the type of work that we do and why we've enlisted Forrester to work with us on this particular study. So Pivot3 is a fast-growing provider of computing infrastructure based in Texas with operations around the world. We're in a category called Hyperconvergence, which really, when you define it, is managing all of your IT resources, your processing, your memory, your storage, your networking under a single management framework, under a single pane of glass, which ultimately simplifies your data center operations, reduces the cost of delivering business services, and perhaps most importantly, increases the flexibility of your IT organization to quickly adapt as new business services are required. So this provides you that flexibility, the economics, and the simplicity required to run a modern-day data center and really move toward that notion of a software-defined data center. We have operations in a number of locations around the world to support our 2,400 customers it is now that are operating in over 53 countries. And you can see a list of some of those customers down below. So the really defining and interesting characteristic of Pivot3 is the size of the deployments that we do and the scale of the operations of our customers. We are designed to support very high volume, high transaction volume, high-performing business applications. We've been put to that test in some of the most demanding IT environments in the world. In fact, if we look at some of the customers that are working with Pivot3, you recognize a lot of the names down below here across the bottom. But you'll also see that 31 of the largest public companies in the world are customers of Pivot3 today. 4 of the 7 largest U.S. federal agencies are customers of Pivot3 today. 2 of the 5 largest aerospace and defense companies and large manufacturers of aeronautical manufacturers and so forth. So people with large-scale processing requirements, large-scale transactional requirements, and a lot of data ingestion requirements rely on Pivot3 to run just not single applications, but increasingly more and more applications that they're bringing under this management paradigm to simplify and their IT operations and get those economics we talked about earlier. And the success that we've had in this area has been recognized and reflected in a study that's just come out from Forrester. And this Forrester wave recognizes Pivot3 in what we call the leader wave in the top right hand of this chart as one of the vendors that is really setting the pace for technology, for the state of the art, on both the state of the current offering and the strategy for taking that to market and delivering value to customers. And this is based on not only the report from Pivot3 on our operations, but also speaking to customers and determining what successes they've had in market. So it complements very nicely what Bob's going to talk to you about today. What's really exciting, though, is that in their research, Forrester identified that of the largest implementations out there in the marketplace, Pivot3 was the supplier for one of the two largest that they found, and in fact the supplier for many of the largest deployments across the entire spectrum of hyperconverged deployments out there in the marketplace today. This is a very fast-growing space or technology category. Pivot3 has been doing it for quite a while, as you can see from our 2,400 customers, and we've got a lot of experience in deploying really large scale and having them grow organically to be very highly reliable, highly resilient, and highly dependable implementations. We have multiple implementations over 10 petabytes under management, and in one particular case, a 7.4 petabyte implementation in a single location with over 270 nodes. So that's the type of deployment that we're designed to scale to, and that provides customers a lot of peace of mind and comfort that they're going to be able to deploy their mission-critical business systems on Pivot3. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob. Bob's representing Forrester. So, Bob, let me turn it over to you, and look forward to your comments on the economic impact of Pivot3, a case study of hyperconvergence that we commissioned Forrester to work on with us. So, Bob?
Thanks, Bruce, for giving me the opportunity to present the results of the case study titled The Total Economic Impact of Pivot3 Hyperconverged Infrastructure, or HCI. Next slide. So I'm going to linger here for about 10 seconds so you can see the agenda that will take place over the next 10 or so slides. Next slide. So what is Forrester and TEI? Well, the next slide will tell you. Forrester has been my employer for the past 15 years. Here's a brief description of Forrester with an emphasis on the underlined words at the bottom. CIOs and lines of business leaders know they can trust Forrester to be completely objective and independent in our research and in the case study results I'm presenting today. Next slide. So a little bit about our TEI approach and framework. Here's a brief description of our approach and framework. Forrester's Total Economic Impact Framework includes performing in-depth interviews with 6 Pivot3 customers that had an average of 18 months experience with Pivot3's HCI solutions. We analyzed the benefits, the costs, flexibility, and risks with each customer. We then created a composite organization which had similar attributes to the 6 interviewed customers, and constructed a financial model and wrote the case study based on that composite organization having very similar attributes and characteristics and goals and objectives of the 6 interviewed customers. Next slide. So I have to do this disclosure, boring stuff. So I'll call your attention to bullets number 4 and 5 below. Number 4, Pivot3 reviewed and provided feedback to Forrester, but Forrester maintained editorial control over the study and its findings, and did not accept changes to the study that contradicted our findings or obscured the meaning of the study. And the customer names, although were provided by Pivot3, Pivot3 did not participate in the customer interviews.
Hey, Bob, let me ask you a question about this study before we get into it further. So how widely adopted is this kind of analysis? Do you do this often with technology companies? And as a secondary question, do you apply sort of basic economic and accounting principles so that our customers can sell the value proposition internally to their CFO? Like, can you take this report and present it to a CFO and they'll recognize a lot of the terminology?
Excellent. Well, I'm proud to say it's a very widely adopted framework, TEI. Over the last 17 years, Forrester's TEI case studies have been used by hundreds and hundreds of technology vendors, including, I might add, 18 of the top 20 technology vendors in the world. The methods Forrester uses includes common textbook finance and economics techniques, so your CFO and others will be able to easily relate to the benefits and the ROI described in the full case study, which, by the way, contains a lot more detail than I'm going to present today, so I would encourage you to read it. Next slide.
And I'll just reinforce what Stacy said earlier, that the actual analysis, the full complete analysis is actually downloadable from that attachments handouts page on the panel for your GoToMeeting.
Our executive summary, next slide. So here's the title page and page 1 of the TEI case study. The good news is the executive summary is written to stand on its own, providing readers with an excellent summary of the rest of the document. The rest of the document, by the way, is going to get into all the detail you need to create your own business case justification for an investment in Pivot3. Next slide. So here's what I call a sneak peek before we get into the details. The high-level results of the case study are presented here. We calculated excellent results, including a 103% ROI, net present value of $700,000, and a very, very quick payback period of 7 months. So let me explain what NPV means. NPV, or net present value, takes into account the time value of money for both costs and benefits, and then nets benefits minus costs. This simply means that a dollar benefit today is worth more than a dollar benefit 1, 2, or 3 years from now. So the NPV of benefits minus the NPV of costs equals $700,000. If you're a finance person, hopefully we have some on the line, you know NPV very well. Otherwise, all you need to know is that the concept of NPV is used by every organization worldwide when they create business case justifications. So once again, the case study, when you read it, is going to be very acceptable to finance people if a finance person is involved in creating your business case justifications, and they will know NPV very well. And payback period. The payback period is the time, usually measured in months, for an organization to recoup its initial investment in a solution. In this case study, the interviewed organizations averaged a very, very quick 7-month payback period, which is really an excellent metric. Next slide. Get into the interview highlights and the TEI model. Forrester interviewed 6 Pivot3 HCI customers. Each were promised anonymity and are only briefly described in the TEI case study. We interviewed a U.S. government office, a utility company, an international airport, a hospital, a UK IT managed services company, and a UK hospital. Next slide. So rather than telling 6 different ROI and benefit stories, Forrester aggregated the data and the information from the 6 customer interviews and told the story using a composite organization, which we do for all of our TEI case studies. The composite organization is described in this slide, along with its pain points and challenges that it's satisfied with Pivot3 HCI, and its goals and objectives, which were satisfied by Pivot3 HCI. The use case involved both VDI and video surveillance. These pain points and goals are shared by almost all organizations. If you're reading them now, you may be nodding your head affirmatively. I'm sure this webinar audience can relate to the pain points and the goals and objectives.
Yeah, so Bob, it looks like the methodology you use is to take the requirements that you learned from those 6 different customers and distill that to this notion of a composite customer that should represent widely the interest, needs, pain points of all the folks on the phone here. So in your experience of customers or readers of your reports typically seen themselves and their organization in the makeup of this composite organization?
Yeah, Bruce, exactly. The composite organization uses common attributes of the 6 interviewed customers, including their pain points, their goals, and objectives. There were common pain points, goals, and objectives across all 6 customers. So each reader of the full case study will find that they share a lot of the attributes of the composite organization we used in our TEI case study.
Great, thank you.
So Forrester was able to quantify 3 key benefit categories resulting from an investment in Pivot3 HCI. Hardware cost avoidance savings of almost $1.4 million, labor cost savings of $139,000, and data center cost savings of $104,000 for total benefits of $1.6 million. And this is over the course of 3 years. Next slide. Let's look at hardware cost avoidance savings, the first savings category. Here's the detail behind these savings, and this is really a great story, great news. Every interviewee cited significant cost savings with Pivot3 HCI over its traditional infrastructure, with estimates averaging around 50% less than an equivalent storage capability using servers and SANs. There are more details in the full case study, once again, that I would encourage you to read. Next slide. Regarding labor cost savings, interviewed customers told me that Pivot3 HCI requires less time to implement and less time to manage on a day-to-day basis. Pivot3 also eliminated VDI-related availability issue help desk tickets and future replacements, and this is kind of a key benefit, I think, going forward. And future replacements of IT administrators could be more junior than predecessors, saving what interviewed customers averaged $40,000 a year. So that's a key benefit. Next slide. Two cost savings categories were represented in the $104,000 saved within the data center. Power and cooling was the first category, and cost avoidance of not having to expand the data center was the second category. So you can see by this slide, for example, that there's a lot of detail, and just above, so this is an actual table from the case study. Just above the table is probably a couple of paragraphs of detailed descriptions of how we arrived at the benefit calculations. Next slide. All right, next slide. The total of the 3 benefit categories was $1,380,110 when risk and present value adjustments were taken into consideration. Next slide. The interviewed customers wanted to make sure I included these 2 additional unquantified but very important benefits. Pivot3's HCI performance was 2 to 3 times faster than the legacy server and storage area network infrastructure that it replaced. And each interviewed customer experienced increased availability, and none experienced unplanned downtime, no unplanned downtime during their experience with Pivot3 HCI. Viewers of this webinar should ask themselves if they can relate to and quantify these specific benefits at their organizations.
That brings up an interesting question, Bob. So I get that these are difficult to quantify, but did you get a sense of how customers prioritize or weight these benefits? I mean, performance and resilience, availability, reliability are pretty important, but did you get a sense of how they would prioritize that?
Exactly. Well, the interviewed customers, of course, weighted quantifiable benefits highest. And when choosing amongst various hyperconverged infrastructure vendors, performance and increased availability ranked very high also on what they were looking for. Next slide. There were costs incurred by the composite organization, which included planning and deployment labor, VMware license fees, and Pivot3's hardware, maintenance, and support costs. These costs totaled $678,977 over 3 years. Next slide. So flexibility, as defined by Forrester's TEI framework, represents the opportunity to make an investment in additional capacity or capability that could be turned into future business benefit. The acquisition of next-gen storage by Pivot3 means Pivot3 can deliver a more complete set of dynamic hyperconverged solutions. This is described in much more detail in the TEI case study. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Forrester's TEI study factoring in two kinds of risk: implementation risk or cost risk, and impact risk or benefit risk. So I want to explain that we looked at, well, let me take a step back. I think everyone on this webinar can agree that there's some risk inherent in every technology investment. So Forrester was able to understand what those risks were, and from a conservative standpoint, we were able to appropriately, and not by much, but reduce the benefit by a risk factor, and increase the cost by a risk factor, so that the risk-adjusted ROI that you're seeing here is actually best case scenario. It already takes into account risk and risk mitigation. Next slide. So you should consider this relative to risk. If a risk-adjusted benefits and ROI still demonstrate a very compelling business case, as it does with Pivot3, it raises confidence that the investment is likely to succeed because the risks that threaten the project have been taken into consideration and quantified. The risk-adjusted numbers should be taken as realistic expectations because they represent the expected value considering risk. Once again, the risk-adjusted ROI was a very, very good 103%. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. Great. A quick recap of the summary results of the case study. Very favorable risk-adjusted 103% ROI, an NPV of over $700,000, and a very quick payback period of 7 months.
Hey, Bob, it's Bruce again.
Yeah.
Do you apply a 3-year cash flow analysis because that's like a common amortization period for capital expenditures, or is that a standard accounting principle to do a 3-year analysis?
Exactly. So with our TEI methodology, we use a 3-year cash flow analysis for all technology investments. And next slide, please. Well, now I'm going to turn it back to Bruce for his comments and Q&A.
Thank you, Bob. That's terrific. And once again, I'll reiterate that you can download this full analysis from the handouts panel on your GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar control panel. And if you go to the website, pivot3.com, you can download this and also the Forrester Wave analysis that we talked about earlier today. So let me see if we have any questions from the audience here. One of the questions here, Bob, is I'm looking to upgrade my current infrastructure. How should I use the information from this report in my search? Do you want to take a first cut at that one?
That's a really good question. Let me think about that for a second. I think readers of the full TEI case study will be able to relate to the common challenges, pain points, goals, and objectives of the 6 interview customers because they were so common amongst those 6 interview customers. As I've said earlier, the case study goes into great detail describing the benefits of Pivot3 HCI. And you should be able to do your own business case justification for an investment in hyperconverged infrastructure solutions using some of the values in that case study. Does that answer your question, Bruce?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've talked through this analysis with a couple of prospects and customers who've been evaluating their own data center needs. And what I've found is that the breakdown you've done very nicely in the report allows them to create a baseline for their own results, right? So they can, your mileage may vary in every case, right? So they can take the criteria that you've set out and ask questions about and itemize in the report and then translate that to their own results inside their data center. So I think it's a really great guide for doing that, and even comparative analyses between, let's say, hyperconverged options versus converged options, which provide a little bit less of the integration that hyperconverged does, and perhaps even against your traditional infrastructure, because a lot of the differential value that you've identified and itemized here, Bob, comes from a transition off of a traditional way to do this IT provisioning to this notion of hyperconvergence, which is fairly new.
Bruce, very well.
Let me ask another question that came from the audience here. Did you have any customers that talked to you about the future uses that they had planned for their hyperconverged infrastructure, specifically Pivot3, but hyperconvergence in general?
Absolutely. Let me think for a moment. So the 6 customers, in addition to their current workloads, which varied, each customer had expressed interest in expanding their use of Pivot3 HCI, this year and next year and coming years. Some common future workloads included database servers, I think app servers, disaster recovery, test dev. And the other thing that came up was each customer was really looking forward to hearing more about Pivot3's acquisition of next-gen storage. And I think they were really looking forward to that once they heard about the acquisition.
That's great. There's one question that's come in from the audience, which is probably more directed to me than you, Bob. But the question is, what are the benefits regarding other HCI solutions such as Hitachi or vSAN, VMware's vSAN offering? So I'll address that. There are only a small number of pure-play hyper-converged vendors in the marketplace that built these products to purpose from the ground up to accommodate, and this is predicated largely on the basis of software-defined storage, expanding into managing the other elements of compute, memory, storage, and so forth. There are only a very small number of vendors that created this from the ground up to support that specific use case. Most of the other vendors have pulled together and integrated multiple existing products in order to create a hyper-converged offering. We expect them to get better over time. But right now, if you're looking for scalability, reliability, proven capability in market with proven customers, then Pivot3 is one of the leaders. And, of course, that leads to quicker ROI, more flexibility in deployment, more experience with successful deployment of applications like VDI, business continuity, disaster recovery, basic server virtualization, capture and management of huge amounts of surveillance data from your IP video cameras that you use for surveillance, analysis of that video data for traffic patterns and movement patterns and time and motion studies and so forth, database applications like point-of-sale applications or online transaction processing applications. These are all advanced applications of hyperconvergence that most of the big sort of legacy vendors who are now entering the space don't have a lot of experience with. So I would argue that your faster ROI, your faster payback period is going to come with a vendor like Pivot3 that's had an enormous amount of experience in a very short time with this new category. I would also argue that Pivot3 has been doing this for a very long time. We've been doing this since 2002. First product hit the market in 2005. A lot of the customers you see have been working with us for many, many years and have had no data loss, continue to add functionality and add infrastructure seamlessly to their arrays or to their implementations very easily without a lot of advanced IT experience brought to bear in order to do that, which I think also lends to the ROI and the faster payback. That is the reduced amount of skills and technology expertise required to administer these types of implementations. Because think about it, when you get all this stuff integrated under a single pane of glass, then there's a lot less integration required before you can deploy your business services. So you're not having to do capacity planning for storage separate from your capacity planning for memory and processing and then cobble them all together in order to get a unit of compute. And then to scale that, of course, you have to do that capacity planning exercise all over again. So the faster ROI and the faster time to value, and probably the most important thing is the flexibility to align with business priorities, comes from working with vendors that have been established in this space for a while. And Pivot3 is the longest standing vendor in this space with the most experience and the biggest implementations. What else have we got here? And there was one other question, Bob. Did customers indicate how advanced their IT organizations were and whether it affected their results? I would tell you that in our experience, we talked to a range of customers with large IT organizations, limited IT organizations, outsourced customers that are using the cloud to burst for burst capacity in some cases. They might be running an internal cloud or hybrid where they have some managed services and some that are resident inside their data centers. Hyperconvergence is a great fit for all of these types of use cases and these different IT organizational skill levels. Because it's very prescriptive out of the box, our hyperconverged solutions make it very easy to deploy and add new functionality, and especially if something fails, right? And hard drives are like bearings on a wheel of a car. Eventually they wear out, right? Spinning disks, in many cases the solid-state disks have a certain life cycle to them. When they fail, Pivot3 will automatically identify that something's going to fail, take it offline, migrate the data someplace else so it's safe, send a warning to Pivot3 or to the IT organization to replace that drive. If we get warned, we actually send a drive to you so that you can replace it. This all happens seamlessly without IT really having to interact very much at all. Put the new drive in, press the button, it recognizes the drive, migrates the data back. That's the kind of resilience and ease of use and management that IT teams are looking for in order to be able to continue to address the new needs being introduced by large amounts of data being ingested into the business now through the Internet of Things and so forth. So there are all kinds of new use cases that require more support from IT, even if the IT organization is less sophisticated. This requires less specialized skills, which I think, again, lends to the ROI and the business benefit. Well, there were no other questions. There were no other questions that we wanted to address today. So, Bob, I want to thank you very much for your time today, and I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. Join us at pivot3.com for more information about Pivot3, about our solutions, how they can help in your data center with your specific use cases and applications. We look forward to engaging with you and your teams on how we can work together to deliver the economic value, the simplicity that you've seen here today, and ultimately the IT flexibility that we've just talked about to your organization. Effectively, how you can achieve over 100% ROI in such short order as the customers that Bob interviewed did in fact realize. I'm Bruce Milne on behalf of Bob Cormier, Forrester, and the rest of the folks here at Pivot3. We want to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.